Season 1, Episode 36 of the Potomac RPG Podcast. System reboot in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome one and all to the Potomac RPG Podcast, your source for old news, tired conversation, and mediocre advice for all of your favorite tabletop role-playing games. I'm your host and system-specific dice that can't be used with anything else, Adam.
I'm your exploding dice, Matt.
And I'm your flanking combatant, Ben.
Thank you for being on the show, guys. Oh, what a night last night. We had a death. We lost somebody last night. Ben, your character Porto. Unknown what will happen, but as it currently stands, Porto is no more.
Yes.
How are you feeling? How are you coping with the loss of your character, which you had just bought the miniature for?
Yes, the miniature had arrived the day before. I had spent the afternoon taking pictures of him, finding a suitable background from the Rainbow Goblins book, and sending it out to the group saying, "Oh, look at the miniature. He's awesome."
Oh, such bad timing. And Matt, your character.
Well, it wasn't just Ben's character. I mean, my character came pretty close last night.
He did.
I got dropped to 0 with a Dretch,
ready to pounce.
It was a brutal combat.
The hard fight, yeah.
It was. But, as we told Steve last night, it's nice to have battles that have consequences, that have something at stake. And luckily, Ben, Porto is a warlock, and as a warlock, you have access to some otherworldly stuff that can kind of make things interesting in terms of your character death. So hopefully this is not the last we've seen of Porto, but as of right now, we are not doing well. We are losing at D&D. But anyway, let's move into the topic for today. Now, we have a tendency to talk about D&D a lot on the show. It's the system we play the most, and it's a system that's most played by people. So there's plenty to talk about, but D&D is far from a perfect design, and there are a ton of different systems out there to explore. So that's what we're going to get into today, game system design. Now, Matt, you've had, I think, the most exposure to different systems. Why are there so many, and what are the designers trying to accomplish when they build out these systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think they kind of come from two different directions. I think one direction is that a game designer or game system wants to focus on a particular theme or idea or setting and sort of builds the rules around that, and that tends to be sometimes a little more simulationist. And a good example might be either like the GURPS Splat books. It's not the system itself, but there's books geared towards a certain thing, or or games around like Warhammer Fantasy is designed obviously around the Warhammer setting. So I think there's an attempt to capture in some games a very particular type of thing that they're going for, and the system sort of is built around that and may do that well and other things not so well. Conversely, I think you have games that have the opposite design philosophy, where there's an attempt to kind of simplify things down and be more generic, and maybe improve the flow of the gameplay at the table. I think the pro to that is I think that's often successful. The con is I think it sometimes doesn't capture certain specific types of things in great detail, and you get sort of a more generic kind of thing is like, well, a weapon's a weapon, or there's not much to be said about vehicles or giant mechs or whatever, right? So I think those are sort of the two kind of competing ideas that drive different types of game design.
Yeah, and sometimes it feels like whether they're going for simulationist or narrative or whatever, sometimes it even seems like they're just finding a better way to resolve that specific one. So, for example, D&D, I would say, is mostly combat
Oh yeah,
focused.
absolutely.
Obviously they've brought in some skill based stuff as well, but the vast majority of the rules center around what you can do in combat, and it chooses a D20 system. There's a ton of other dice mechanics or card mechanics or whatever out there. Like, do you have an opinion? Well, let's turn to you, Ben. Do you have an opinion in terms of when it comes to dice resolution within a mechanic? Like, what's your favorite? What do you think works the best in resolving whatever it is you're trying to resolve?
So we definitely have the most experience with the D20 system, and I think that it's pretty good for what it gives you, which is a very swingy way of resolving conflicts. Things could go bad or they could go well, and there's the middle ground is kind of sparsely populated, and most of the time there's like this threshold. The DC is 10. If you get above a 10, it's a pass. If you get a 10 or lower, 10 or higher, it's a pass, and below that, it's a fail. So that's good, and you have the chance of critical success on the 20, critical fail on the one where something really bad and something really good happens. But there are, I mean, that doesn't quite model exactly how it would happen in how things are kind of happen in the real world, where most of the time
it's a game.
You do an average job.
Yeah. So there are definitely systems that work differently. So I mentioned GURPS. GURPS is one where you use a 3d6, which is really bell curve, right? So you have 3d6 plus your skill or whatever. But the thing is you're usually going to roll very close to the average. Some other systems use 2d6s, and I think we may talk about some of them more. Traveler does, for example, 5th edition. And so that's a similar, not as severe, but it's the same type of thing. But there's also alternatives, right? So you can have dice pools or dice pools that you push your luck. You can have a card-based system, which is actually kind of interesting because with card-based systems, you can pull a card and then you have a deck which can then be excluded after you pull them, so the possibilities narrow, right, as the scenario goes on. So there are other types of resolutions. There's exploding dice, which if you roll, say, the maximum on a die, you get to roll the die again. So it's like a crit. But there's a decision you have to make, right, when you design a game, which is how much swing is there going to be, and how much are static bonuses going to matter. And one of the issues that came up in Pathfinder First Edition, and I think Ben might want to talk more about this, is that as you get to higher levels and the bonuses accrue, the swing of the die matters less, because now most of your total's coming from the bonuses, which isn't.
You get a plus 15.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is 5th edition has sort of solved somewhat by really scaling back the range of the game. It's bounded. I think maybe it's scaled back a little too much. But the point is that there's a probability decision to make for task resolution. And if you try to introduce multiple ones, it can get very complicated. So any game designer has to really think about, well, what do I want the task resolution of the game to look like?
Yeah. And you brought up to me the other day, Matt, and I think it's a good point. Like you talked about the difference between narrative and simulationist and gamist, and the different mechanics and what to focus on in terms of social versus combat. But the one that you pointed out really kind of stuck with me, and that's player character growth in terms of how a player progresses through a system. So for example, with D&D, depending on whether you choose milestone or experience, things can ramp up fairly quickly.
Oh yeah, it's almost. I mean, it's not quite Dragon Ball Z, but yeah, yeah. I mean, close, it's like, right? Well, we've been adventuring for 2 months and we cleared these dungeons, and now I can, polymorph people or something. It's probably worse with casters than warriors. Linear fighters versus quadratic wizards. But D&D has it's a very deep power up where the characters power up really along this path and get really powerful. Conversely, you can have a system where it gets harder to do that, but the characters can broaden. So maybe you don't become great at cutting down giants, but you pick up some other skills, and the character becomes a broader character. But again, that's a design decision that when you make a game, you have to think about that also, because that's one of the things that people love about RPGs is the characters growing and being able to do more things, but you also have to decide is there a cap? Is there a soft cap? Does it get harder to do this? How does that meet the challenges that come about later in the game? And so that's not an easy question to answer, and a lot of that really gets down to how you envision the other, the high end of the scale. Sometimes when you design a game, it's not a bad idea to pick 3 points to say early, middle, and late. What should characters look like and what challenges do they face? And then sort of use that to calibrate how your character growth should work.
Yeah, and how it makes sense in terms of designing encounters and moving through a story. Because, for example, what we see in our weekly game is suddenly I don't know how to do something, then suddenly I'm able to do these 5 other things that I just got because I leveled up. But there's no story explanation as to why I can now do this. And that takes a lot of skill from the DM and player cooperation to try to, and that's something that Steve tried to do whenever we were hitting our milestone, 3rd level for most of us, trying to set something up so it made sense why all of a sudden you gain these new powers that you had no ability to do just yesterday, so that's another kind of focus for a lot of designers is, how do I make them better while still making it make sense within the game? In terms of player character growth, Ben, how is there a system that you think does it good for you?
First, I want to say that I think it's incredibly important to have player character growth in some fantastical way, because I think that's what draw people into RPGs that you don't get in real life or through other mediums. I mean, dramas and fiction, they have development of characters through relationships and overcoming their personal obstacles in their lives. But fantasy and sci-fi have this great potential to make the characters grow by tremendous amounts in level of capabilities and relationships, and really it's a fantasy where the sky is really the limit, or not even a limit. So
that's a great point, because I just thought about it in my head, if we weren't getting these amazing powers, would the game be as interesting, or would we be as interested in the game as we are? Because that is a key part of it. If the difference between a first level and a late game level was that you learned how to code in C+ or something, probably not going to whet the appetite. But being able to toss down a fireball next level is pretty big thing. So I can understand that completely. But we're going to dive a little deeper into this topic here with some questions. Let's get into our first one. Our first post comes from Reddit user Porter Pirate, who asks, "Why are crunchy systems considered simulationist? At one point, I thought this was true, but having exposure to more and different game systems has really changed my view. Either that or I'm just older and less inclined to put up with the crap I don't have to. I find lighter rule sets to better support," this is a tough one, "verisimilitude Did I say that
Yeah, I
right?
think that's correct.
I think it's verisimilitude,
Believableness.
but
Yeah,
okay.
okay. Then heavier rules that more directly dictate outcome. I find it much easier to have an outcome that fits the setting and fictional positioning, making it better simulation when less rules or looser rules are present. I also find narrative rule ideas to better represent simulation as play. Things like tags in City of Mist, for example, can provide much more detailed and believable effects than specific wound levels or conditions, especially because they can be created on the fly to account for pretty much any fictional position. Or maybe I just don't get the term simulationist. So the interesting post here by Porter Pirate, Ben. Crunchy systems are often considered more simulationist in nature. Do you think that general consensus is right here, or do you think this poster might have a point in thinking the opposite?
So I had to read a little bit into what exactly simulationist really means to understand this.
Okay.
And uh, please chime in, Matt and Adam. But there is these three pillars of RPG systems describing how they work. The GNU model, where you have gamism, being able to win, having obstacles and overcoming them to win. The narrative aspect of RPGs, where you're telling a story where the GM and the players can contribute to their character development and the way that events are working in the world. And then the simulation, the where simulation is aspect, where they have rules and codifying exactly how things work, so that you have this greater understanding of whatever the task is that you're doing. And it doesn't have to be around combat, it could be having rules about how crafting works, or really how anything that you want to focus on works. It could be rules around communication and social interaction. It could be rules around politics and caste systems, or whatever. It's just this fine scale detail that the game designer and the players kind of buy into, as we want to model exactly how this is working in some fine detail to get that understanding, and to have a basis uh, to work off of, to know what the actions that we can do, how we are expecting them to um, to come out in the game. What is the result from these actions? What would we expect to see, so that everybody has this common understanding of what's going on. And
So, out of the different
Pretty right.
systems, I mean, you've played City of Mist, you've played D&D, you've, remember our kind of survival aspect back in Anthony's second campaign there. Do you find more rules around something makes it more simulationist, or do you think the lesser, more loose rules better reflect the outcome that you expect in a simulation?
I think that really depends on the um, the situation that you're in. Having rules around a situation makes it easier to understand the situation, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with it. And combat is something like this.
Gotcha.
We, as modern, usually Americans, don't have a lot of experience in physical combat. I know I don't.
Speak for yourself. Out on the battlegrounds every day, trying to make a living.
Especially like magical combat. It's against dragons or something.
I grew up throwing fireballs. What are you talking about?
So
Well,
we need to have those rules so that we can understand and get into those roles. But things like something that's rules light in Dungeons and Dragons, that's just handled by like a charisma check, is social interaction. That's really handled just by how much the DM and the players think that these social interactions are going, and then on top of that, you have a dice roll.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about this, Matt? Like, what makes a game simulationist to you?
So I think for me, Simulationist is a game that not necessarily the whole game, but there's a certain aspect of the game where, because you can't have a game that's simulationist about everything, because then you have a virtual reality simulator. But you have a game that focuses on a particular topic. And an example that I like to think about when I think of simulationist is GURPS. Not GURPS in and of itself. The core system is not inherently simulationist. But then GURPS has all these splat books. There's like GURPS vehicles, GURPS firearms, GURPS spaceships. And if you've ever read any of those, they go into gory detail about, how guns work and, bolt action and the cartridge size. And there's like rules for these things. And and if you want that level of detail, right? You can play that. Like if you are seriously, like, let's say you're super into guns, right? Which I'm not, but let's say you are, right? And you wanted to play a game where, we are like playing the game is like reading through, a volume of guns and ammo, and that's your thing. Well, it's actually kind of cool to have that, right? If you or vehicles, a lot of games, kind of just hand wave that have vehicles, just sort of hand wave, chases and things like that. But suddenly you have this extensive rule set for vehicles that describes like all these things that vehicles can do and realistically simulates, overheating and torque and, everything that can happen, in a car or a truck, and if that's what you really want to focus on, then that can actually be really good, because unlike a game that's more narrative, which yes can handle anything, it's not ad hoc. So you have a consistent rule set versus something that might change game to game. The downside is you can't be simulationist about everything. A rule book like that would be the size of a building. So it's really only worth it to be simulationist about one or two things that a game is going to focus on, as like kind of like giant robots. If you're playing Gundam the game or something, right? You obviously want a system that really details like as much as possible in terms of verisimilitude, the giant robots, what that would look like, right? I mean, but you wouldn't have that for everything that can happen in the game, because the game would be it would be huge and too many rules.
Yeah, there's definitely a fine line of detail.
And there's also there's also like two aspects of simulationists too. One is the rules surrounding a specific thing to try to make it follow the same rules as reality in a way. So for example, there might be starvation rules in terms of X percentage per day, or X, Y, and Z happens. So there's that part of the simulation, but there's also the outcome simulation. So for example, I think back to first campaign when my character Finbin jumped off a ship with his shield underneath him to kind of cannonball into an enemy. Well, D&D didn't really have specific rules in terms of what should happen there. And what it ended up being was basically fall damage. And that was kind of it. And the outcome of that didn't really feel simulationist, because in my mind, okay, he's falling through the air, he's hitting someone. This should be something a bit more.
But D&D is not simulationist. I mean,
no,
if you're falling,
I
take damage. You broke your legs, you have a ruptured spleen. We don't go into the details of what would actually happen, right?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. But I think those are the two sides of it: is the outcome versus the rule set in terms of a simulation. So, in terms of the question asker, Porter Pirate, I think they have a point in that, the outcome of something could be more simulationist because it's more realistic. But I do agree with you guys that having the rule set around it, that's kind of this real simulation part. You're trying to put parameters around something to make it as real as possible. And I think that's why crunchy systems usually handle that a bit better. But we're kind of in the same boat as you, Porter Pirate, and definitely an interesting question for you to bring up. Really appreciate it. But who knows? Maybe they'll find a way to to balance both and have a rules light, pure simulation game. Think that'll happen, guys?
No, never.
No.
That's asking quite a bit.
I have news here.
And the sound of Ralphie the News Goblin can mean only one thing. It's time for Potomac RPG News. So this week we wanted to highlight an article from Coleman Gailloreto over at ScreenRant.com titled Easy to Hack Table RPGs for Aspiring Creators. So the article highlights a few systems that makes things simple enough to easily build your own game around. If you're tired of the published systems and want to build your own world, these are some good choices for base mechanics. Now, we've played a few of the systems mentioned in this article. Matt, what do you think of the author's advice on using one of these to hack your own game?
Yeah, I mean, it depends, on the kind of game you want to run and put together. I mean, so we've played Dungeon World, which I think is the Apocalypse system. And a lot of the systems he highlights are actually kind of similar. Like I think Fate, which is a fairly popular system, and Cortex Prime are kind of similar. They're opposed dice pools, and dice pool systems actually can be kind of neat because you get the satisfaction of rolling like a whole bunch of dice. I mean,
Agreed.
You get that it's more than just 1d20. You're rolling like 5d6 or 5d10 or whatever.
More dice the better, man.
Or more dice the better. And so I think those systems are designed to be fairly adaptable systems. And yes, you can put your own system together. I think, using them, I think the sort of the drawbacks you get with those systems is I think the character development kind of can get limited. So, well, you're adding more dice to the pool or maybe getting a bonus to your target number. But I think that the generic systems sort of ultimately have a kind of drawback in sort of their ceiling in terms of growth, if that makes any sense. I don't know how to better explain that. I think you can add more things, or you can add more actions types that your character can do, but I think the genericness of the systems ultimately limit it for like a long, like our Dungeon World campaign. Like it was fun. I mean, it was a lot of fun, and it was good for kind of a short. I felt it was good for kind of a short type of adventure, but I don't know if we could do like a year-long campaign with that rule set.
Yeah, I think the general rules of Powered by the Apocalypse, I think just the basis of success, mixed success, and failure, and taking hard actions from the GM, I think that does allow a lot of flexibility for you to bring in your own stuff. What happens with a lot of, I mean, just the number of PBTA games out there shows how hackable this system is and how flexible it is. That the difficulty, I think, in it is it can be a real rabbit hole of types, because you start locking down into these basically like these source books, or these I forget what they call them, but like the different classes and stuff.
They have
that
splat books for each.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And things can get a little wild. Now, in this article, they mentioned a couple others. They mentioned Fate. They mentioned Cortex Prime. Have you guys ever played Cortex Prime? Or there's another one called Tunnel Goons.
Yeah, so I looked at the thing about Tunnel Goons. So Tunnel Goons, the mechanics struck me as a lot like 5th edition Traveler, because I think it was 2d6 plus skill. Again, the problem that comes up is the variation's not going to be very high. With the 2d6 system, So I don't know if how much time is now. Fate is very popular, and I know it's been used for like Cyberpunk and things like that. And Cortex Prime sounded actually pretty interesting. It's something I might want to say. But again, you have there's other systems out there too. I mean, there's the Fusion system, which the DM picks what kind of die you use. So you can use a D10 or a 3d6 plus your attributes, and that was used actually for, I think the most popular one with that is the Artesia game, which is based on the fantasy comic. For anyone who's ever read it, it's actually pretty awesome. But I haven't had a chance to play the game. And yeah, so there's other systems. There's roll and keep, like the 7C system, which is one I've wanted to actually play for a while. I haven't had a chance. So there are other ones out there. I think the generic sort of kind of simple systems have the advantage of being readily adaptable to any kind of setting that you want to do, at least to dip into it. I don't know if those systems would be good if you wanted to do like a whole world super campaign. I don't know if they would hold up under kind of that strain, but if you just wanted to run like, a short adventure or three, I think the systems are very good for that.
So there is one system that I've been a little curious about, which is the Cipher system by Monty Cook, and the Numenera world that's around it. It seems like a really interesting and rules light way of running the games, very narratively focused. Adam, I know that you've had some experience with that, but what has been your feeling actually playing that game?
It's kind of hard to judge because basically I played just a few sessions of Numenera, probably about, I'd say, a year before our group started. So I wasn't super experienced in, TTRPGs in general. I think the difficulty I had with Numenera was, number one, there aren't a ton of classes. It's more like a type that you pick and then you build out and customize from there, which is cool in general. But as a new player, I had a hard time kind of figuring out what that was. Whereas other games that have specific classes, it's a little bit easier to kind of get in the mindset that, oh, I am this. So at the time I played, there were only three. Ben, I think you said now there's four different character types.
Warrior, Adept, Explorer, and
is that the Jack?
No, Jack is Adept.
Okay. Yeah. But basically what and another thing that I ran into was, in terms of resolution of conflict, I actually found myself stuck a couple times where, like, just within the game itself, and maybe it was just the scenario we were in, like, it's hard to explain. Like, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what my options were. It was very confusing for a first time player to come in and figure out what to do. It's a very deep world, very detailed world. And I think it's one of those systems that once you really read up on it, you can really make some cool characters. But as an ignorant newbie who didn't know anything, it was a little tough, but certainly willing to give it another look. I mean, it's Monty Cook.
And that's actually a good point. I think different systems require different levels of sort of mastery on the part of the players. I
agree.
And I think some of the advantages of of games like Fate and Cortex and those systems is they are in apocalypses. They're easy to pick up and play.
But also dependent on the imagination of your players too. So for example, for those who can handle rules really well, some of these more complex systems might be actually easier than some of these rules, like, because for games like Dungeon World or City of Mist, it requires you to kind of imagine what your player could do. Well, some people are more comfortable looking at a sheet of paper and saying, I'm going to do this or that.
I can attack with my sword.
Exactly. Well, in some of those PBTA games, it's not quite that simple. Like, you're trying to come up with some creative thing to do, and boy, that well can run dry real quick for some players. So I don't know. And I think in terms of easy to hack, I think the article's right on it. Like, I think the ones mentioned are probably the easiest to build your own TTRPG out of. If you're interested in making your own tabletop role-playing game and kind of want to check out some of these systems, I have the Link in the show notes for you to check out, and best of luck. Have fun with it. For right now, though, we're going to step out for a moment. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after the break. You know, when we were first getting this podcast together, we knew we needed some good music. And we looked into a lot of options that are out there, but we settled on Soundstripe. At soundstripe.com, they have such a wide variety of high-quality music to choose from. Every song that you hear on this podcast is from Soundstripe, and we couldn't be happier with what they have to offer. And it's not just music. They have a ton of sound effects and video stock footage as well. So if you're making a podcast or videos on YouTube or have some creative project you're working on, check out Soundstripe. They're worth a look. And right now you can use the promo code Potomac RPG, all one word, and get 10% off. That's Potomac RPG, all one word, to get 10% off your purchase. Elevate your work with the finest stock media all in one place at soundstripe.com. And with that, let's get back to the show. Okay, how about another question? This post comes from Reddit user Jimmy DeBomb, who asks, Dungeon World, what part have you struggled with when coming from D&D? I'm working on an essay for an expansion toolkit, which is meant to talk about some of the most common pitfalls that D&D players experience. I know many of the most common ones, how combat works, how the GM preps, but I was wondering if there are others. So what do you struggle with? Thanks. Note, this is not to badmouth either D&D or Dungeon World. Both are great games for what they do. So Ben, this is a question that we're in a good position to talk about since we took a short break from D&D to give Dungeon World a try. So how about it? What part of that switch was a struggle for you as a player, or was it pretty seamless?
So just to get everybody onto the same basis, Dungeon World fantasy, it is based around certain character classes. For instance, my character class was a type of rogue, and you have different parts of your background that you set forth at the beginning. You've got different relationships that you have with the other characters and the environment around you, and then you've got certain abilities that you can do, like one of the abilities that I picked was making poison and being able to apply it to weapons. And then you've got certain escalations of these abilities and the ability to get other abilities as you level and experience, which is all nice and good. And but the disconnect between that and like D&D, the biggest one was that the characters and the dungeon master are very actively participating in the narrative of the game, in that the dungeon master presents the situation and then hands it off to the character to say exactly what's going to happen. And it's got in improv, there's this concept of yes and, where if somebody says something, you say, yes, that's exactly what's happening, and this other thing is happening. That's exactly what's happening in Dungeon World, in that whatever you say, what anyone at the table says, becomes the canon for the game. It gives tremendous power to the characters, the players. Everybody is really working on the same level. The DM is got some pre-existing stuff that they start with, but even a lot of the Dungeon World supporting material says you don't really need to prepare a whole lot for Dungeon World, because you can just have a situation that you start off with, and then you and the characters use your creativity to build out the narrative from there. and it gives it a really spontaneous feel to it. So that's the basis that we can kind of understand it from. What I found difficult was taking that initiative as a player and kind of, using that initiative, because in Dungeons and Dragons, you have things that you can do, and you've got predefined kind of power levels that you are working within. You know exactly what's possible and what makes sense in the world. You've got pretty good understanding of all of the factors and how they're interacting. And in Dungeon World, you don't really have that. So I struggled with kind of fitting some of my narrative into what the world was portraying, and trying to, be respectful of where the dungeon master was trying to take the situation, and maybe that's something that I should have just gone with what I felt like would have worked, because that's kind of what Dungeon World is all about, is taking your own narrative inputs and creativity and integrating that into the game as a truly collaborative thing.
Interesting point. Well, Matt, you played
Yeah,
a druid
Yeah.
type character,
Yeah,
right?
Druid. It was actually kind of fun. So I think what Ben said earlier is definitely the case, that it's kind of this collaborative world building. And Anthony was pretty much was like I spent a lot less time prepping this than I would a D&D game, because you don't need to spend the time setting up like all this stuff, because a lot of what happens as a kind of consequence of what the players say happens. But again, there's a couple of having a very open system had a couple of drawbacks. I mean, one, like Ben mentioned, is that it's kind of hard to say, well, is this a good thing for the character to say? I mean, are we going to push it in this direction? And it can also run into like it's good for I think for short adventures, but the idea is if you're world building, the DM's got to keeps track of everything that happens and says, and then you go and play another game, and assuming it's the same world, well, is that stuff still valid? So you don't want to like contradict stuff that came before if you played a long game. But for me, the biggest problem I thought was, some of the powers are fairly open-ended. Like my druid had shape-shifting powers and in elemental control powers, and so I wasn't sure, like, okay, what can I do with this power? I just got like elemental form, or let me take like elemental form. So if I turn into like a fire elemental, like what kind of ability can I have? Can I burn things? Can I be physical? Am I physical? Am I not physical? Can I squeeze through? And it's not clear. Like the mechanics that you can take like 3 like things when you change shape or something, depending on your successes, or up to 3. But it's not clear like what those things are. Like I turn into an earth element. Okay, can I hit an area? Like if I smash down, does it hit an area? How does that work? So I mean, and the idea is the game is supposed to be flexible, but sometimes I felt like certain powers need like elemental control also. Like it's like I'm summoning water or something. Like what are some limits? Like you don't have to define everything you can do with the power. It's a creative open game, but it's not a bad idea to have at least some guidelines or limits. I think when you don't have any, it makes it hard to sort of conceptualize what's possible and what's not.
Yeah, I
because there
absolutely
is
felt that.
there's a level of respect for the GM and the other players that okay, I can turn into an earth elemental and I swallow all the enemies into the ground with me because I take up a football field size, because there's
why
no
not?
constraints. Why not? It's having some parameters definitely helps. I actually ran into the opposite problem with mine. I chose the ranger, and just kind of testing the waters. I couldn't believe that we were like a couple levels in or whatever, and I'm looking at the skill list, and I was not able to find anything that I wanted to take. And I felt very limited within the ranger class in terms of what I could do, because the actual abilities were a bit more defined than say yours, Matt. Like they were pretty, cut and dry
and I think they
abilities.
varied a lot. Like spellcasters.
They really did.
Yeah, like it was. That's the thing. It's a loose system, and and maybe it needs another revision or addition or something. I think some of these systems get tighter as they go on.
Agreed. Well, yeah, and for the question asker, Jimmy, basically, I think what I'm hearing here is the transition. What makes it tough is having a good understanding of what's allowed and what's not, or what's appropriate and what's not. So for anyone making that switch over, maybe a good session 0 will kind of knock out some of those kinks. But that was a real tough part for us. It wasn't so much the imagination, but how to cohesively work as a team within the boundaries of what the GM was looking to create. So I think that's kind of the biggest struggle that we ran into. But best of luck with it. Would love to read that essay that you're working on just to see what you had to say about it. So best of luck out there, Jimmy. But we've been talking about a lot of different systems today and game design and everything, but I'm curious to see just how much you guys know when it comes to this stuff. So let's put you two to the test. Listeners, it is trivia time. Welcome to Trivia Time, where we pit our two guests against each other in a battle of game knowledge and history. So here's how it'll work. I pulled a quiz from somewhere. I'll find it eventually. Let you know, but basically it's the ultimate tabletop role-playing game quiz. So this is a multiple choice quiz. I'll read the questions and the choices. You're allowed to ring in early. But if you do, I'm going to stop reading and you'll have to answer the question without hearing the rest. You lose a point if you get it wrong. First one to buzz in gets to answer. You get it right, you get the point. Get it wrong, lose a point, and your opponent gets a chance to steal. Better yet, you can steal without fear of losing a point. Ben, you have your work cut out for you against Matt here. He knows the different systems, but let's see what you two can do. You two ready?
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, let's get into it. All right, so we're going to start with question number 1. This cyberpunk RPG blends magic and fantasy with advanced weaponry and complex computer systems. So you might have an orc hacker and an elf with... Matt? Shadowrun is correct. Well done, Matt. You have 1 point. That was pretty easy for you, wasn't it? I have a feeling you were just waiting for an opportunity.
Cyber and magic. I was like, there's only one.
All right. So the score is 1 for Matt, 0 for Ben. Question number 2. Dungeons and Dragons was the first tabletop RPG, and its success inspired quite a few similar games. What game, also released in the 1970s, duplicate... Ben?
1970s. Shit. I was going to say Pathfinder, but no.
Well, you might as well guess something.
Okay. Oh, man. Okay. I lose.
I lose is incorrect, so you lose a point. Would you like to hear the rest of the question, Matt?
Absolutely.
All right. Dungeons and Dragons was the first tabletop RPG, and its success inspired quite a few similar games. What game, also released in the 1970s, duplicated the Dungeons and Dragons name, but swapped in a different underground structure and monster? Was it 1, Tunnels and Trolls, 2, Caverns and Catoblepas, or 3, Basements and Banshees?
What were the first 2 again?
Tunnels and Trolls, Caverns and Catoblepas. I don't.
Catoblepas.
Yeah, whatever. And Basements and Banshees.
Well, I don't know, but I'm gonna guess B because I like Catoblepas.
That is incorrect. The correct answer was Tunnels and Trolls. But you're still in the lead, 1 to -1. Question number 3. The first post-apocalyptic RPG was set in a world seeded with barely functioning technology and some very, very strange mutants, bears with laser eyes. What was it called? 1, Paranoia, 2, Gamma World, or 3, Rifts?
B,
Matt.
Gamma World.
Gamma World is correct. Well done. 2-1. Question number 4. What current RPG produced by Monte Cook Games takes the idea of the inhabitants? Ben?
Is it Numenera?
Numenera is correct. Well done. Back up to 0.
Yes!
Question number 5. What RPG allows players to take on the roles of vampires vying for political advantage in a setting that's a dark mirror of the modern world? 1. Vampire. Ben?
Vampire the Masquerade.
Vampire the Masquerade is correct. Well done. Question number 6. All of White Wolf's Monsters as Protagonists RPGs took place in the same universe. What was it called? 1. The Twilight Convocation. 2. The Penumbra. Or 3. The World of Darkness.
World of Darkness.
Yeah, we were just talking about that.
Yeah.
All right. Question number 7. Which edition of Dungeons & Dragons replaced previous rule systems with class-specific powers that mimic the way abilities function in online RPGs? 1. 3rd, 2. 5th, or 3. 4th?
Fourth edition.
4th edition is correct. Well done. 4-1. Question number 8. Pathfinder is a best-selling RPG that actually based on an earlier edition of what other RPG? 1. Ben.
It was based off of a 3.5 edition of Dungeons and Dragons.
Very good. Well done. 4-2. Coming back. Question number 9. Dread is a horror RPG that uses a unique and innovative task resolution system instead of rolling dice. What is it? 1. Players must pull a brick from a Jenga tower without knocking the tower over to succeed at a task. 2. Players literally throw coins at each other to determine if an attack hits or misses. 3. Players place a device like a small mousetrap on his or her finger and must endure a certain number of turns of the key, which increases tension on the device to succeed. Ben.
I really hope it's C.
It is not C. I'm sorry. That is incorrect. Matt, what's your guess?
I'm going to go with A, the Jenga tower.
It is the Jenga tower. Well done. Although that third one sounds pretty awesome. Might have to give that one a shot.
It'll also open them up to lawsuits, probably.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds very dready. So, okay.
Yes, absolutely. All right, last question. The Savage Worlds RPG doesn't use dice to determine initiative order in combat. What does it use instead? 1, a deck of standard playing cards with the jokers included. 2, a bidding system using points accrued from earlier combats. Or 3, initiative simply passes around the table to the GM's left.
I'm going to guess A, cards.
Yes, A is correct. The deck of standard playing cards. Matt, you ended up with 6 points to Ben's 1. Well done. You are the champion of trivia time this week. Congratulations. Hey, Ben, you held in there, man. I appreciate the effort. A couple unlucky guesses, but you stood strong in the face of overwhelming odds there. So I appreciate it.
Well done, Matt.
But I missed the trolls, the tunnels and trolls. I should have known that one.
Yeah,
I've heard it before, but
I should take it away from you just for that.
Just for that, yeah.
So let's get into our last post for the week. This post comes from Reddit user Russet Moon, who asks, to Ars Magica or not to Ars Magica? This is my first time posting here, so apologies for any formatting errors or mistakes. Also, lengthy post, blah, blah, blah. In any case, I've been stewing on a game concept that I'd want to try out at some point. I have the setting and lore all figured out, but what I'm struggling with is which game or system to adapt the idea to. I only have experience with D&D 5e, but was advised to look into Ars Magica among other systems, and it seems like the closest fit. However, while reading through the 5e rulebook, the amount of content and rules is staggering, and while I think I understand the basics, I'm uncertain as to how well I'd be able to successfully run a game using its rules. Overall, I think I'm looking for advice on a couple of different things as listed below, and a link to the setting and lore is down below as well. Advice on whether the game's concept I have would even work with Ars Magica, if Ars Magica is the best option, any advice on running a game like this, or any tips from experienced Ars Magica players to make the game go as smoothly as possible? And 3, how much of the Ars Magica rules should I incorporate? What can be pared down or simplified, or how much of the rules would even be necessary for a game like this? So the poster goes on to describe their world that they're creating and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it looks like a post on the Atlas Games forum, actually.
Exactly. So, Matt, I had to put this in for you. You've expressed your love for Ars Magica many a time. So a little holiday present for you. Ben and I haven't had any experience with Ars, so this is all you, brother.
So the poster's concerns are the concerns that people have. So Ars Magica it's a heavy game. And it really helps if the players are familiar with the rules as well. That being said, I think he doesn't necessarily need to have the whole kit and caboodle. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Ars Magica, the big draw of Ars Magica is the magic system itself. It uses a very flexible system where you have skills in what's called technique and form, and you basically create spells by mixing the techniques and forms, and there's guidelines at different difficulty levels of the kinds of things you can do. So it's very open, but also sets certain limits, so you don't have kind of the issue we had with Dungeon World. And there's been attempts to incorporate it into other systems. I've seen attempts to put it into D20. I've seen attempts to put it into Shadowrun. And I think they all fail because the dice mechanics are very different. But I think that the player, what the poster suggested for his players, in terms of doing a play-by-post or a live text feed, actually would work very well for Ars Magica, because the way Ars Magica works in terms of experience is it progresses in seasons. So in each season, the characters choose to do lab research or investigate this or do a seasonal activity to advance their arts or other skills or whatever. And honestly, that part's pretty boring, right? You don't need to play that live. That's more like, okay, this is what the character's doing in the background for this season. But then for the actual quote unquote adventuring, and it's not really a dungeon crawl game, but there's things that your characters will handle in person, or their companions or grogs can do. There's other types of characters you can mix in. That you can do live. So in a way, having kind of a mix of a live post and a monthly kind of play by email actually could work very well for that system. The other thing is that even though it's very rules heavy, you don't necessarily need to do all of the rules. Like some of the rules are about like building your covenant, but if you don't want to focus on that, you can just hand wave that part of it. You can focus on the magic development. If there's a social aspect or dealing with the nobility or the church or whatever, right, you can focus on that. So you don't necessarily need to use all the rules for Ars Magica. You don't necessarily need to use all of the setting information. You don't need to use all of the rules for other types of supernatural systems that other people aside from the Hermetic wizards are using if you don't want to. So I think that I would advise really sort of just having kind of a narrowly focused Ars game for starters, and then see how it works, and if they want to expand into other things, then using the rules for all those things, like not worrying so much about magic item creation unless the players really are going to want to do that, or not worry too much about magical auras and regiones unless again that the players want to deal with that type of thing.
That's good advice for us at Mood and Air. What I'm curious about, though, since Ben and I have never played this, if you had to sell Ars to us right now, how would you do? Like, what is so great about Ars Magica?
Here's what's great about it. You can have a party of like 10 wizards, 10 mages, and they're all different. Like that's it, the only thing that is similar is Pendragon for knights, where you can have 10 knights and they're all different, because the game really, it drills down, has a virtue flaw system. There's a lot of twists you can have on the character, how their magic works. There's plot background, so it's, and they have their houses and the associations with their houses, which you may not want to deal with if you're doing a narrow game. But there's so much. It's a deep, heavy game. And it's a very rewarding type of game if everyone's willing to do the work and learn the system and learn all the intricacies of it. That's the disadvantage to the game. It's a heavy game, but it really creates an incredible kind of palette for just the type of character you can make and the things you can do and try to do. And it's not Dungeons and Dragons. It's not a dungeon crawl where you go through killing things and taking their stuff, although you could do that occasionally. But it's more like you have this incredible power. I mean, even as a fresh mage, right, past his apprenticeship out of Gauntlet, already you can probably wipe out an army in many cases, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just a question of you get more powerful time, but what are you going to do with it, right? I mean, you're going to build a city under the sea or a tower to the heavens or change political situation in all of Europe. I mean, it's really more, in a way, it's collaborative storytelling, kind of like Dungeon World, but it's more structured, and it's really important for the DM to get feedback from the players of what they want to do, and then sort of have the events progress along those path, along that path in a kind of some semi-realistic fashion. And it's a heavy game, but it has an incredible just spread of possibilities that you don't see in a lot of games.
It really does sound very epic.
It does. Yeah. Ben, I don't know about you, but we'll have to give this a shot at some time. I mean, we have a group that's willing to do.
Yeah, I think Steve was going to get the core rule book, and I have the core.
Was it?
Yeah. And the core rule book is pretty good, and it's really all you need to play a game, basically. And then you have all these source books, and it helps to have maybe one setting, one tribunal book, because that's the region of Europe, historically that you're in.
I gotta admit, the passion that you have for it is contagious, though, because I hear you talk about it. I can hear how much you love this game.
When I first read the 5th edition core rule book, it was complicated. It's like, wow, there's a lot of rules, and I'm reading through it. And then there was a moment when where it kind of clicked. Yeah. Right. And suddenly when it clicked, I said, wait, you can do that. You can do this. You can do that. And that was a moment for me. Like, it was just like, like the horizons expanded for the possibilities. And for me, for a lot of RPGs, I think that's very often the thing that gets me into the game. The moment where I see these possibilities just sort of in mist on the horizon that the game can do. And that's what draws me in. Maybe the mechanics aren't great. Maybe there's other issues or whatever with different games. But the moment I can kind of see the possibilities of the game, that's inspiring. Yeah.
Well, all good stuff, guys. Thank you so much. That's going to do it for us this week, though. Remember, if you want to send in your questions or anything you find on the internet, you can send them to questions@potomacrpg.com. Check out our store for merch at teespring.com/stores/PotomacRPG. We got shirts, mugs, all sorts of stuff on there. If you'd like to support the Potomac RPG podcast, you can find us on coffee.com/PotomacRPG. And lastly, you can follow us at Potomac RPG on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Thanks for being on today, Matt and Ben. Thank you to the rest of the Potomac RPG crew, and of course, all of our listeners out there. So, for the Potomac RPG podcast, I'm Adam.
I'm Matt.
And I'm Ben.
Until next time, keep those dice rolling, keep those stories coming, and
never
stop playing.
So it basically, it's this argument of objective truth versus postmodernism as viewed through the lens of magic, which is kind of...
That's really interesting.
My eyes have already glassed over. That's very complex.